Welcome to Neurotypical's Don't Juggle Chainsaws, the podcast that cuts through the rubbish to explore the world of neurodiversity. I'm your host, Nick King.
And I'm your host, Kate Fox, and together we're here to explore, understand and celebrate being neurodivergent in a neurotypical world. From ADHD and autism to dyslexia and other quirky brains, we talk about it all.
And go off on tangents. So whether you're neurodivergent, love someone who is, or you're just curious about neurodivergent minds, you are in the right place.
Let's get ready to juggle some words and maybe even a few chainsaws, metaphorically, of course.
Hi, welcome back to Neurotypical's Don't Juggle Chainsaws with Nick King. And this time we've got a very special guest and we have Amy Pearson with us. And I'm awful at introductions, so I'm going to let her introduce herself.
I am also notoriously terrible at introductions. And my script changed recently, so it's been a little bit harder. But yeah, I'm Dr. Amy Pearson. I am an assistant professor at Durham University, and I have been at Durham University for 7 months now. I am a late diagnosed autistic woman, and I do research around identity, autistic masking, relationships, and understanding victimization among autistic people.
And fabulous. And the book. We need the book, the masking book.
Yes.
That needs to come.
Yeah. So last year, I wrote a book with Kieran Rose, the autistic advocate, on autistic masking and understanding identity management and how stigma plays a role in masking. And that was published in June by Pavilion.
And it's fabulous. If not a little heavier to read. I really need I need an audiobook.
Yeah, we are definitely, it is on the cards. So we are going to record an audiobook version at some point. That would have happened a little bit earlier, but with switching institutions, it's taken a little while to get that on the cards. But yeah, that will definitely be out at some point.
We can all relax to it.
Yeah. It's not the most relaxing read. Someone on Amazon left a review saying it was a bit dreary, and I was like, well, I'm sorry that a topic that disproportionately kills our community is not fun to read about.
I feel like I should have done a trigger warning for this one very suddenly. Maybe we'll put that on the front end later. Yeah. Okay. Genuinely, masking is dangerous for our community. It is harmful. It is prevalent. Maybe we can start with how masking isn't context switching. So masking isn't the fact that I have currently a very large in capital letters "do not swear" on the screen next to me because I'm at work.
Yes. Yeah, so I think that's something that we've only really recently started to pick apart as well in academia, is that we tend to think of context switching or identity management as something that all people do. So we all have different hats that we wear in different social situations, whether that is talking more about things that interest you with a particular group of friends, or not swearing when you're at work so that you look more professional to other people and don't offend anybody. And everybody does that. So that's something we think everyone does. There might be exceptions to that rule. But masking is not that. It partially has some of the same things involved. So it means that we have to think about who we're interacting with, what kind of person we're presenting ourselves to be, and what that other person might expect from us. But one of the key things that Kieran and I think really sets masking apart from context switching is this issue of authenticity. So when we context switch, we're still ourselves, we're still authentically ourselves. We're just kind of really highlighting bits of ourselves that are more relevant for that situation, or we're dampening down bits of ourselves that we don't think are as relevant in that situation. So if I am with I'll say my old monsoonies, so the people that I used to work with when I was like 17 to 21, that I'm still really good friends with, we worked in the monsoon clothes shop together. And when we're together, we talk about like our daily lives and stuff we do. And we also bitch about customers that we had literally like 17 years ago. But I don't talk as much about my interest in weightlifting when I'm with them, because that's something that they would just find a little bit dull. So they know that I do it, but I wouldn't talk about it a lot. Whereas with my gym friends, that's obviously a huge topic of conversation, right? So that's still an authentic part of me. But masking is when you are expressing in some way an inauthentic version of yourself. So that might be suppressing parts of you that you would really like to let other people see. So it might be not talking about your interests at all for fear that other people are going to judge you about them. It might be forcing yourself to make eye contact with people if you find it really uncomfortable. But it might also be projecting bits of yourself that aren't you in order to try and show a different person. So we often talk about masking as hiding, but masking can often also involve kind of projecting a not you version of you. So someone that you think other people might want to see, and that might be a person that is more extroverted or more confident or a bit of a class clown. But that isn't necessarily who you really are.
Hello, welcome back to Neurotypicals Don't Juggle Chainsaws, and we are again with the lovely Dr. Amy Pearson. Do we need to do a quick introduction again? Very quick. Fabulous.
I do an extra quick introduction.
An extra quick one, just in case they missed the first one.
Yeah, I'm Dr. Amy Pearson. I'm an assistant professor in psychology at Durham University, and I'm also autistic.
I like that. That was succinct. I'm a fan of succinct. And we're going to talk about masking again, because that is something of an interest of yours. And we like people talking about their interests because it brings us joy. However, I think we're going to do something slightly more specific this time. And maybe we can talk about autism and gender, because I think we are not long out of the only women mask, we could tell them about the female autism phenotype.
Yep.
Which isn't a thing, everybody. It's not a thing. Autism isn't gendered. Masking isn't gendered. Only autism and like autistic women mask isn't a thing, but we are going to break it down. So where do we start? Where do we start with the... Let's start with the masking women were hiding from the diagnosticians. And actually, it was all our fault in the first place.
Yeah, this is why I refer to myself on Twitter as a sneaky autist. Because, I was just out there hiding in plain sight. Yeah, so I just wanted to kind of pick up on what you said before that, because you say, we're not long out of this idea that only women mask. And I think a lot of research is still deep in that narrative.
It's still there.
There's a lot of misperception that masking is a woman thing. It is and I say this in inverted commas, a high functioning autistic thing, that only certain kinds of people can mask. And those are the people that are more passable, that you would never expect. So yeah, that leads nicely into the idea that there is a certain kind of person who masks. That masking is very limited. It's an unhelpful narrative. It's so unhelpful. This idea that we didn't diagnose people because they were hiding from us. It's not victim blaming, is it?
Victim blaming.
It's victim blaming. And it's not intentionally victim blaming. That's not what psychiatrists are meaning to say, but that is kind of what they're suggesting. So I think there's a massive issue there. So the big problem is that for years and years, our representation of autism, all of the research on autism was with boys, mostly white boys who are very young, few adults scattered in there occasionally for a little bit of novelty, but most of the research that was out there was with autistic boys and men. And that's because our diagnostic criteria were based around representations, mostly from autistic boys, not even autistic men. And so we had this very limited representation of what autism looks like. So if you have a list and you're looking down that list and you're trying to see whether someone meets that list and that person aligns really well, you're like, yes, great. And if you have a list and you meet a person and you're trying to see when they don't meet that list and you're like, well, this list doesn't seem to apply to this person because they don't meet these really, really specific examples I have.
They are not a white man with brown hair who happens to be a software engineer. Or really
no, Yeah, probably not
Because
going to meet that
I'm not
list.
meeting that.
No. And so it ends up resulting in confirmation bias in the diagnostic process. So you have this kind of limited set of criteria that applies to a limited range of people, and you continue to apply it to that limited range of people. So that sample gets bigger and bigger, and everyone else who differs from that kind of ends up being left out, which means that we end up missing the nuance. So one of the things that I like to highlight when we talk about autistic people of varying presentations, varying genders, who have other various identities, that when, as a psychologist, when we talk about this, like in the wild among humans, we talk about something called individual differences. So we say that, well, people are different from each other, right? They're all unique. They have different personalities. They have different ways of thinking. They have different ways of feeling. But when we talk about neurodivergent people, or people who've been conceptualized historically as being disordered, we talk about something called heterogeneity. So we say, well, these people are similar because they all fall into this particular category. And when they differ from each other, it's because of this special thing called heterogeneity, which means sometimes we find differences in that population. And actually, I think what we mean there is that these people are humans, and humans differ from each other. So autistic girls not being exactly like autistic boys should not be a surprise to anyone. I'm sure many people have heard this. I have heard it personally, I think only once, thankfully, but like, oh, well, you're nothing like and then it's usually like my friend's son, it's always someone's son, someone's nephew, like
And
my
as almost
6-year-old or
40-year-old women, it's really weird that we're not like 8-year-old boys.
yeah, like this 6-year-old autistic boy and me don't, I mean, to be fair, I love Godzilla, and so I often have a lot in common with autistic 6-year-old boys because I'm like, yeah, same interests, very cool. But generally, no, as a woman approaching 40, I don't seem very much like a child. Yeah, and that shouldn't be surprising, but it is. And that, I think, is because dehumanizing approaches has been so built into the way we think about autistic people, like the language we use, talking about people as heterogeneous rather than having individual differences, as, being missed. Yeah, we've been missed, but it's not because we were hiding. It leads to this kind of conception that we're different, we're qualitatively different, and we are people. People differ from each other. Autistic people differ from each other. We all have different values, different interests, and different ways of being in the world. And I think that for clinicians can be really difficult to hold as a piece of information alongside the information that some people also have learned how to suppress or hide aspects of themselves or project another version of themselves. Because I think it's really easy to then start conflating, well, this person doesn't look like this stereotype, therefore they must be doing something that makes them not look like this stereotype, instead of actually this thing that we have as a concept might look like lots of different things. And some of the people who fit within that category might also be engaging in ways to keep themselves safe. It's a lot easier to say, oh, well, this girl was missed because she's obsessed with horses instead of trains, than to be like, trains and horses are just two legitimate interests. And it's the varying passion and the strength of that actually might distinguish this person from a different kind of person.
It also doesn't address in any way that women are socialized differently from birth, and that we are required to be more caring, more nurturing. I always hold in my head that I think it was a Channel 4 documentary where they changed the clothes on babies from like pink to blue, and they got a ton of sort of like child workers who personally thought they were very open to children playing with any toys, and the second they saw that child wearing pink, they brought them a doll. And the second they saw that child wearing blue, they brought them a ton of blocks to build and knock down. And then we hold that, only autistic people can do trains and building and STEM. And that, you can't be autistic and nurturing or caring or self-sacrificing in the way that many women are, brought up and conditioned to be.
Yes, and I'm not going to go on a rant about the extreme male brain theory of autism, because that is...
We can. No, to be fair, we've kind of already done it.
Yeah, and it's not fun for any of us, is it?
I am also aggrieved that I do personally feel that stopped my diagnosis for roughly a decade.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people feel that way. But one of the things that I find really interesting, so I've recently started to have conversations about this, is that when we talk about masking, like, this is such a complex topic when we start thinking about the ways in which it intersects with different aspects of identity. Because even if we take something like gender, you don't just socialize, you don't just internalize your own socialization. So you also internalize how everyone else is socialized and how that differs to you and the expectations that are put on you. So it's like, we're going to see masking maybe look different in women or people from gender minorities or autistic men from different backgrounds, because you're internalizing information about the kind of person that you should be. And that's coming from the people around you. So, you're expected to be quiet, or you're expected to be assertive, or you're expected to be interested in football. Like,
yeah,
the same stereotypes exist for autistic boys. And I think we're moving towards conversations about understanding that autistic people can present in different ways. Like, we've started to talk about things like internalizing and externalizing, but again, it's a really binary kind of dichotomy between, you were able to push some of your emotions down and you're more likely to be anxious, versus you let them out and that's more visible, and so you're more likely to be judged as aggressive or kind of having behavioral problems.
Yeah.
But actually, those two things are still very binary. There are lots of different ways that things can manifest or be pushed down depending on the expectations of people around you. And I think that's really what we get at its core. It's not that autistic women mask more. It's that people, including autistic women, mask differently depending on the kinds of expectations that have been placed on them. And gender plays a huge part in that, the expectations that people have about how you will perform your gender and how they socialize you into your gender and how comfortable that feels for you. And that becomes even more complicated if those gendered expectations don't match with who you feel like you are inside. And then you feel like you're masking that and being autistic. So it's like you're not performing being a human correctly, and you're not performing being the gender of the human that you're expected to be correctly either. So that starts to make things, I think, even more complicated for people and even more scary.
Within our community, it's actually a minority of people who identify as the gender they were identified as birth and as the sexuality that they are, meant to have. The cis hetero man, I think, is down to 38% in our community, I believe. Yeah, straight cisgendered people are actually a minority within our community. And then again, that's back into being perceived as well, and narratives. We went to school during Section 28. We might be falling into some very new and complicated narratives that look a lot like Section 28 again, in a very different kind of form. And you back into that sort of where you feel safe, who you feel safe with, and how they are perceiving you. And is that okay?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the short answer is no to that, but the long answer is very long and very complicated. I think
And not full of solutions either that we can actually fundamentally like start to look to change. It's bigger.
Yeah, there are some really, really massive issues going on at the moment that will lead to long-term harm, I think, for a lot of people, and complicate situations that are already very complicated and that are already causing a lot of distress and a lot of trauma.
And we talk about that, don't we? Within minority communities, people have concepts around, you know, when they weren't safe, there was a level of masking. You know, you could frame it as in like the LGBTQ plus community, the closet, or even slightly before that, people used to have like lavender relationships where they were in what was perceived to be a straight relationship, but were actually like a foursome. Or you know, people had a beard. If you know, they had this concept of like a physical, you know, beard mask of somebody who was with them, so they could be perceived as acceptable by society. And fundamentally, it's about minority groups who don't feel safe, that have to keep themselves safe by masking. And then there's this observational model of going, you were hiding, and we were like, but you didn't make a world that was safe for us to be out in. So yes, thanks.
Yeah, effectively. Yeah, and I think pulling that in is really helpful, because I think that, you know, I always say as psychologists, we often work in silos. And so we up until really, I think, I don't want to be like, oh, until the paper from Kieran and I, but you know, that there hadn't really been a discussion bringing in principles from other fields that had looked at these issues. And so we had research from different areas saying, you know, this is something that marginalized groups do because of stigma. It is not something that is unique to autistic people, which I think was kind of what people started to think with the narrative around masking. This is an autistic thing. And it's like, oh, it's not. Identity management, human thing. Masking, camouflaging, concealment, whatever you want to call it, minority group thing. It's something, a stigmatized human thing. It's something that people who feel like they aren't safe have to do. And so being able to draw actually all of that understanding into how we think about autistic masking is really helpful, because it not just helps to understand that context of stigma, but it also helps us to think about how people who fall into multiple categories of being minoritized in some way, whether that's through your gender or, again, like your race, your ethnicity, or your sexuality, might also be masking other things at the same time, and that might complicate things in different ways for different kinds of people.
I was reading a statistic about, I think it was teachers or professionals who work with children who had come into the profession during Section 28, and I think the stat was like under 30% of them were out because of that sort of that felt stigma, the perceived sort of stigma when you were identified. And I think, obviously, you know, myself, you, the people that we talk to on this podcast, many other sort of people in our community are very, very out. And we have a level of privilege and safety that allows us to be out.
Yeah.
But I know so many people, particularly, you know, who work in the public sector, particularly, some in the private sector, where they don't feel safe to be openly autistic, and they are still very, very heavily masking, and them being perceived in a very interesting way, and then being blamed for their masking, and then burning out, and also being blamed for burning out. And no concept of like a lack of safety and environment that would allow them to be very openly autistic and, you know, professionally masked, as opposed to, you know.
And this is something that definitely is a problem in academia and autism research. Like I know of other autism researchers who are not out, you know, of people who are ostensibly viewed as a neurotypical researcher. And that is because those people don't feel safe. They've had bad experiences. They feel like it would threaten their career. It's just not safe for them to be out. And I think it's a major thing that actually we don't talk about it enough, like that issue of disclosure, and how that relates to masking. Like, you can disclose and still mask. Like, you can be out, you can be out about being autistic and still mask. But equally, you can also be masked and not disclose, and be having to manage all of that at the same time too.
Yeah. And do you think it is? So my hubby is serving the autism stereotype. He is, a software engineer for an international bank, and his colleagues are all out. They're all autistic. When there used to be, group meetings before COVID, when they all actually went to work, there was fidgets out. Nobody cared about eye contact. Like, those meetings were very, very different to the corporate meetings that happened in the people section of the bank. And they were all fine because they all knew and they all stood each other. But I think when you start sort of mixing that, particularly amongst, there is something about mixing it amongst sort of still women in the workplace, because there are still concepts around women being difficult in the workplace, women being bossy in the workplace, women being overrepresented in the workplace when they are actually underrepresented.
Yeah.
And then, if we put a layer of sort of another intersectionality or three on top of that, it becomes very difficult and very problematic to feel safe enough to be openly autistic and not masked.
Yeah.
And I haven't got an immediate solution either. But maybe just the fact that we're starting to have these conversations in little sort of open pockets of the world. But I think when you said to me that, like, because my understanding is that women are now overrepresented in autism research.
Yeah, very much so.
Yeah.
Hugely.
But apparently we're still on, we need more women, and like, women masking's like a thing, and I'm like, are we not over that? We've moved on. Like,
yeah, like it's a bit of a weird one, because I think when we say, like, historically women are underrepresented, they still are. But the majority of research that's coming out, at least qualitative research, is very, very autistic woman heavy. And then we have other groups that just are still really very underrepresented. So within that, we still don't have, like, very many autistic Black women or Asian women or people who aren't white represented in autism research. There are so many issues that lead to that. Like, there's some, I won't go into it because, time, but there's great work out there on that from, like, Black autistic scholars as well, who've done some absolutely phenomenal work talking about some of the issues around intersectionality. But again, like, I think there's this view that if we just bring one group along at a time, like, gradually we'll fix things, and that I don't think that's very helpful, because all it does is it just kind of shifts the narrative a little bit, but still not in the right direction. So we go, okay, well, we focused on autistic men for a really long time, so now we're going to focus on autistic women, only this really limited subset of autistic women, and we'll make all of our decisions about autistic people based on this subset of autistic women. You're like, that's not fixing things. It's just changing things to a not good alternative.
Also, did anyone ask? Like, do you know, like, who picked? How did they pick? And how much privilege did they have when they picked? Like, who decided?
It's an excellent question. And to be fair, there is probably an answer.
But for fear of being sued, that we won't even go into. But
you probably pinpoint something in the literature at some point where someone will have said, what about these people?
What about these people? And then we will write that we need those people in every paper since then.
Yeah.
And it becomes a bit of a sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy, doesn't it? And again,
it does,
an observational model of everything, without considering, community and insight and the wider scope of just being a human in the world, where you're being observed and categorized within a deficit model. I
Yeah.
hope so.
There is a lot for us to fix. Like, there's a lot of work to do. And I think autism research is well, I always think it's moving on. Like, things have changed a hell of a lot in the
It's
past
moving
10
on.
years. It is moving. But not as fast as we would like. And there could be more critical mass. So I think obviously I'm in a complete bubble. Like, I work with people who have very similar views to me. I collaborate with people who have very similar views for very obvious reasons. But when you go to bigger conferences and things and you see actually it's not necessarily the prevailing viewpoint, it shows us how much further we have to go. And I think that actually, to bring it back to masking there, it does end up being part of the problem, is that you do get people who don't work within these quite inclusive narratives hearing these ideas and being like, oh, that's really interesting. That might relate to this thing that I do. And then looking at that again from like a very limited and uninclusive viewpoint. And then that's how you end up with things like a female phenotype. And that sort of thing. It's better. I mean, I guess it's better than the female protective effect, right? That's the other theory of why women go undiagnosed, and it's just that it takes a bigger hit of autism in order for it to be expressed, because we have protective genetics.
No. Just no.
Just no.
Just no. Just no.
It takes more of the autism to make us actually visibly autistic.
You can't inject it. Like, that's also not true.
Well, I was going to say,
We're not doubling up.
Said about like, did you know that COVID jab?
Go and double the autisms.
Oh, there's I'll clarify for people who can't read sarcasm overtone like that. That is a joke. It's not,
very, very
not
much.
Yeah, not being serious there.
But it's a continuing. There's all sorts of narratives around autism and women, and then even more when you get into like motherhood and parenting.
Yes.
And I have an awful habit, and we all have done this in the previous podcast, of singing "We Don't Talk About Bruno" Professionals, because I always go back to Bruno Bettelheim and blaming, the refrigerator mothers, and reasonably that was the 1960s, and can we get over it yet? And we're not. We are not over it yet.
No.
And it's still hanging around like a off-fridge smell. And I think there is so much gender inequality still that we struggle to conceptualize. Even just thinking about the Olympics, this is the first Olympics where we've had 50-50 men and women.
Which is wild.
We think that we've had, gender equality in sports for forever. And we definitely haven't had gender equality within the autistic community for figuratively 5 minutes, let alone forever. And I think on one hand, there's a level where we need patience, but on the other hand, there's a level where you need listening, isn't there? Because so much could have been so much better if somebody had just turned around and went, "What are you on about?"
Yeah.
It's not how it works.
No. And I think it does lead to things being really overlooked. So the study that I was telling you about before from Ashton, looking at autistic motherhood, like masking came up as a huge part of the experience of burnout, masking and trying to perform motherhood in a neurotypical way and perform like all of these expectations of what a mother and a wife does, was having such a negative impact on people. And it was really contributing towards them becoming really, really ill. And that's something that I think when we don't look at key issues in people's lives and we think of masking as kind of like this really decontextualized thing, like we call it social, but we don't think about those social influences and actually how they shape it, that we miss out on those things, which end up being crucial and thinking about how we support people to recover from things like burnout. Masking is a huge part of that, but it doesn't exist in a vacuum. So what do we do to then integrate that understanding of things like gendered expectations and how that relates to different areas of life, like employment and motherhood, into how we then help people recover?
Yeah. And where expectations on women generally, and then before we're adding disability and intersectionality and the general demands of jobs and life and the mental workload. It's not about the physical workload anymore. We're not back in the time where we're doing laundry by hand. The mental workload of existing as, you know, a woman who works full time, is potentially a parent, is a partner, the list is quite long. And then if you add that you have disabled children, which is very, very likely, and we will need another podcast on that one before down that lane. And I think we possibly, we will come back and do that one.
I do think it's important because I think it's another one of those elephants in the room, is that these pressures on autistic women, autistic mothers, a lot of these autistic women have autistic and neurodivergent partners, but there is still the expectation that you will carry the additional cognitive load that comes with doing that woman's role. And so you don't get cut the slack.
Absolutely not.
No.
And you will be very, very likely very, very badly perceived. No matter what you do within that sort of that context and that situation, because you are not complying as the neurotypical adult who will not go off and research all the rubbish that they tell you and then show up with a very pleasant mask on your face that will appease them. It's not happening. And we are totally getting blamed for that. Completely different podcast, and we're going to stop there. I very, very much appreciate your time, Amy, and I think we'll be talking to you again soon. Thanks for tuning in to Neurotypicals Don't Juggle Chainsaws. We're so glad you joined us today to explore the fascinating world of neurodivergence with your hosts, me, Nick King.
And me, Kate Fox. If our conversation sparked a thought, a question, or even a smile, don't keep it to yourself. Drop us a line at hello@neurotypicalsdon'tjugglechainsaws.co.uk or visit our website, neurotypicalsdon'tjugglechainsaws.co.uk, to write in. We'd love to hear from you.
If you enjoyed today's episode, consider leaving us a 5-star review on your favourite podcast platform.
Until next time, keep embracing the unique ways you juggle the chainsaws of life.